Hello and welcome to the Journal.ie's Facebook Live. I'm Aoife Barry and with me today is Aoife McElwain. So you might get confused between the two Aoifes, so I make it easy when you're tuning in. And the reason why we're chatting today is because Aoife wrote a book called Slow at Work, and a lot of you might have some New Year's resolutions for 2018. You want to be a bit more productive in work, or you want to have a bit more balance. You want to be able to be in the office doing your work like the people behind us here, but you also want to enjoy your breaks. So that's what Aoife is going to be talking to us about. Now, let's start off with the reason why you wrote the book, Aoife, because Slow at Work isn't something that you just kind of came up with one day. It was really inspired by your own personal experience.
Absolutely. It absolutely was. So Slow at Work has been my way of reimagining my work life. So about 2.5 years ago, I hit peak burnout and I physically had to stop working for a short period of time. So I had just been on a constant treadmill of deadlines, busyness, fears and anxieties around work. And it was a very natural part of maybe how I was building my career. So what I mean by that is I was really trying to prove myself, I suppose. So, but I thought that to do that, I just had to work all the time and never take any breaks. So anyway, I just got to a point of burnout and I really had to reevaluate how I was approaching work because I was feeling so burnt out. It meant that it was really hard for me to connect to the actual achievements that I was making at that time. So everything on paper looked pretty good. Like I was writing for national newspapers about food. I was working as a food stylist for brands on like really interesting kind of food campaigns. That's just such a mad job anyway. But and I was also working in a mostly full-time job with a really fascinating creative strategy and design agency. And so I had all these opportunities and was doing things that I'd always wanted to do, but I wasn't enjoying any of it, really. I felt constantly like an imposter, that I wasn't good enough for the work that I was doing, etc., etc., etc.
Yeah, a lot of heavy feelings.
Yeah,
and, I mean, some people watching, I'm sure a lot of people watching will recognise a lot of those. And just to say, if you do have questions for Aoife about any of this, about trying to be less busy in an always-on world, which is what your book is about, do leave your comments in the comments below or your questions, and we'll try and get to them during this Facebook Live with Aoife McElwain. So you got to this point and you thought, I'm just bananas busy.
Yeah, So there was two things that kind of, I think when people feel burnt out, it happens differently for lots of different people. And I'm certainly not an expert on burnout. I've just experienced it myself. Yeah. So I think first it was a mental thing. I felt very, very anxious, and that led to a period of depression. And then there was the physical. And there's an idea of something called forced recovery. Mm-hmm. And that's when your body is like, you know what, I can't do this anymore. Stop. Yeah. So I had my back basically gave up on me, and that was when I physically had to stop. So I just, one day I could not get out of bed, and the next day my husband had to help me get to the doctor, and then I was put on Valium for 10 days, which was great, but then the Valium ran out, and I realized I can't stay on Valium forever. Yeah. So that was when I knew I needed to change. So because I'm a compulsively busy person, my way of figuring out how I was going to change was to set up a series of talks and workshops answering this question: is it possible to slow down at work and still keep up? Mm-hmm. And definitely the irony wasn't really lost on me that I was doing more to slow down.
Yeah.
But that's who I am. That's the kind of person I am. And I love projects. That's why my experience with burnout was so upsetting, because I love work. I love meeting new people. I love having a challenge, all of those things. I love using my creativity at work. So I wanted to be able to enjoy work, at least like 80% of the time. I'm not going to, I'm always probably going to hate doing my taxes or whatever, but I just wanted to find a way to change. So about 6 months after that, then about a year into doing talks, I was approached by Guild Books to put that format into a book. So it's been an amazing opportunity to really look at these issues that I was experiencing at work, and talking to experts about them, talking to other workers about how they had overcome them, and just looking at the information that was out there from other people who had gone through the same thing, and just trying to write my own plan of how I wanted to be at work. And so that's what this book is.
And it's interesting because the main title is Slow at Work, but the subtitle, I suppose, is How to Work Less, Achieve More and Regain Your Balance in an Always-On World. Yeah. And it's a bit of a mouthful, but it's really, the idea of an always-on world is something that, here in the journal.ie, we're always on. We're, digital media. We have to know what's on Facebook, Twitter, what's happening around the place. And like everybody else, we're all very attached to our phones as well. I'm sure many people watching this are either watching on their phone or have their phone next to them if they're watching on the desktop computer. So I suppose, one of the things you definitely challenge on this is the idea of how you interact with social media, how you interact with technology, while accepting that you probably need both of them to possibly do your job or at least live your life in some way.
Absolutely. I absolutely love social media. I love Instagram particularly now, and I used to adore Twitter until 45 ruined it all for us. But no, it was already not that much fun anymore. But anyway, sorry, my point is that I think, yes, those things are always on, but it is absolutely impossible for us as a person, you as an individual, to always be on and monitoring that. And that's why you have teams. Yeah. So I think it is a personal, that's a real personal sort of discovery of how much online time you can manage. So for me, I think, and I don't think it's appropriate to say, every night at 8 o'clock you need to switch off your phone. I don't think that's appropriate, because actually everybody's schedule is different, and it's actually kind of magic that if you want to, if you're a working mom, if you want to do your work after 8 o'clock when your kids are in bed, and so that you can have your own successful business, that's amazing that people can do that. So it's just about, I think, managing our own expectations of how much we can actually work, and realizing that social media, if it is your work, then that you're going to need to take a break from that as well. But I also think, and I'm so guilty of this, and I have to constantly monitor myself. One of the stories in the book that I share, it was an interview that Charlie Brooker, the writer of Black Mirror, did with Terry Gross on NPR. And it just really changed the way I think about social media. So he was just saying that he used to be a really, really heavy chain smoker. And every day he would wake up and the first thing he did was light a cigarette. And so looking in bed and looking at that now, it's that is disgusting. But maybe 30 years ago we would have been like, yeah, sure.
It was normal. Yeah.
So, and then he was like, but now what I do is I wake up and I pick up my phone and I start scrolling through it. And he's like, I'm starting to wonder is that as kind of gross as smoking in bed? And so I thought, so then I started to call it, I had this idea of chain scrolling. So it's instead of chain smoking, are you just mindlessly scrolling? And it's so easy to do it.
Guilty. I know that is something that I certainly do quite a bit,
And sometimes, even, I also find myself sometimes ping-ponging as well, because you're and it's it's this mindless sort of refreshing. And sometimes I think this is really a personal thing, but I think it's something to do, it can be, when I get into this sort of mindless ping pong of refreshing Twitter, opening Instagram, going to Facebook, back into WhatsApp. And then, but I think there's a part of me that's looking for that little praise hit, and it's just bing, dopamine, and it's ooh. And then, of course, if I'm not being consciously I'm not looking at my phone for the next 3 hours or half an hour or whatever it might be, I think it's kind of understandable that we're where are my little hearts? Where are my little likes? And I think what's really, really important is to just be really careful that you're not getting your self-esteem boost from these little bits of praise, and that's something that I kind of work on constantly. And I also think there's some really interesting ideas of Another book that I found really interesting for my research was by a guy called Cal Newport, who wrote a book called Deep Work, and his idea is to have these periods of uninterrupted work for 3 to 4 hours, and he argues that that's actually a kind of a dying skill.
Wow.
And so that the people who are able to do that, to really focus, will inherit the earth, basically. But I think it's, it's got problems, and it's not practical for many people, and it's better for some type of work than other. So if you're a writer or a researcher, it's phenomenal to have that kind of unbroken time. But I just think ideas like that are really useful when we can take something from it, maybe not everything, but I think the lesson for me certainly has just been to be a bit more mindful about how much my phone is dictating how I feel and how I think, because I think the danger of looking at it first thing in the morning when you're still a little sleepy and vulnerable is that you're allowing somebody else to put thoughts into your mind, if you know what I mean.
Completely, yeah.
So it's not you going, today, what am I going to do? What are my priorities? What's on my, what am I doing today?
Yeah.
It's like, cat video, or,
negative news cycle
Exactly.
you can get caught into. And even, before you go to sleep, we have a question from Jeff and Stony Batter, who's left a question for us there.
Hi, Jeff.
Don't be afraid to leave your own comments on the Facebook Live there. He said, any advice for how to disengage from a smartphone at night? Now, you mentioned this, you do have a kind of, like a routine that you follow in terms of when you stop your own screen time. So do you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I interviewed this fascinating, fantastic woman called Deirdre McSwiney for my book, and she's a sleep technologist and a CBT, cognitive behavioral therapist. So she advises that screen time, we should not be having any screen time. TV is okay, I think, but we shouldn't be having screen time, laptops or phones, for 2 hours before we are trying to go to sleep.
Right.
And the idea is, it just makes sense, really.
Yeah.
It's just about letting your brain relax and disengage from work, etc. So that's really so much easier said than done. And I think it is just about discipline. And for someone who is not disciplined, I had to just be really strict. And again, I mentioned the kind of loose boundaries. It's like getting this balance of being disciplined with yourself, but not giving yourself a hard time if you, like let's say 10 o'clock one night and you're still on your phone. Okay, so what I would recommend, what I do is, first of all, I tried getting an alarm clock because that is usually the excuse that people use. It's like, it's my alarm clock. So I went out and got this like really cute little kind of vintage, old-fashioned, one of those like round alarm clocks, and set it, and then the next morning myself and my husband were like, it was like a fire truck was in the room. It was just like and that was actually really stressful.
So, that doesn't sound very soothing when you're trying to make your life a little bit more chilled. Give up the phone, like putting a cockerel or something in the back garden.
Exactly.
Not a good idea.
No, exactly. So I was like, okay, so the phone is actually a very good functional alarm clock. My rule of myself is when it's in my bedroom, it's on airplane mode. Because I find as well, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, and that's a very vulnerable time, because that's when you can get a little bit anxious. I personally can get those little worries seem amplified in the middle of the night. And that's when, if you get the phone out, and then your sleep is very interrupted then. So I put it on airplane mode at night, and I also and I just put it in a drawer in the living room as well if we're watching TV together, because I think that is a really weird thing that so many people do. Is
on the phone while watching TV or a movie, something that your concentration is split between the two things.
And I think just making one choice to just, watch one thing, I think it's fine. So that's what I would recommend. Airplane mode, it's very useful.
Excellent. So hopefully Jeff and Stony Batter, that might help you there. 2 hours. And
a friend of mine actually has a really, I like her approach. So she's a 10 p.m. to 10 a.m. rule. It goes off at 10 p.m. and she doesn't look at it again until 10 a.m. And I think that's her evenings and her mornings. I think that's really really good.
That's a good chunk of time.
Yeah.
And you talk to loads of people in this book. So the book it's all about your experience, but it's also about all these experts from loads of different fields who are giving you advice, either through you interviewing them or going to meet them in their place of work, or you're reading their books. Who stood out for you that gave you really good advice in terms of keeping that balance between work and life, which is what we're talking about here on this Facebook Live. We're talking about doing the work you need to do, but also doing the relaxation time. So who did you meet that really stood out to you?
Oh, they were just, honestly, that was one of the, I really mean this, it was one of the great pleasures and privileges of getting to work on this project, was the people that I got to speak to and learn from, and all of these conversations that I had with, I interviewed over 60 people for the book, and just to learn from their experiences was amazing. One of the funnier ones was I went to interview a Buddhist monk who has a Buddhist retreat in Cavan.
This story, yeah.
And I was going down there in the car and had about 10 questions ready for him. And I was like, I think that I have an hour with him, so I think that'll be enough. That'll be plenty of questions. You know yourself. And so I got down there. He's quite an elderly monk now as well. I think he's in his 80s. And so I got down there, and an hour into this interview, and we're still on question 1. Right. And I thought to myself, I was like, gosh, I really need to get him to speed up and just go faster, and I need to get more info. And then I was like, Aoife, this is for a book called Slow at Work, and here you are trying to rush a Buddhist monk. So I learned, and then this was the thing, so just then we were just saying goodbye, and he had been telling me about his life, and how when he was a young monk, he was put into labour camps by the Chinese, which happened to, as many people know, to many Tibetan monks. And so he had this really dramatic story of how he had to escape from, so he was in the prison camp for a couple of years, I believe, and he had this really dramatic story about how he and 2 of his friends escaped, and they had to get through to India in the Himalayas in the middle of the night. So just as we were leaving and I was saying goodbye to him, he said, but I want you to know that I'm really grateful to those prison guards. And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, because they had worked us so hard. We had been working in these labour camps for 16 hours, 18 hours, 20 hours a day. So we were really strong. So by the time we were escaping to the Himalayas, we were actually really physically fit, and we would never have made it out alive if they hadn't worked us so hard. And I was like, oh, God.
That's an incredible, it's like a deep story that you're learning from somebody there.
Yeah, it was, so that was kind of a lesson in resilience, but it was also a lesson in, if you want to learn something from somebody, you need to be patient, and then also that you cannot rush an elderly Buddhist monk. But, there were so many people. I loved talking to my friend, the farmer, Richard McDonnell. He has a dairy farm in Limerick, and actually, there's a lot of statistics about farming being one of the most dangerous jobs, and there's a huge issue with burnout in farming, particularly farming with animals, because it is that, talk about 24/7. I mean, that you have to look after the animals, and so he had this beautiful expression that he shared with me about how farmers often talk about finding some leaning on the gate time.
Oh, wow.
So I absolutely loved that. So just time to, outside of your day, to reflect on what you're doing in your business, what you're doing with your life. And I just love that idea of, and so maybe you don't have a gate at your disposal that you can lean out and look out onto a beautiful field full of dairy cows. But that was really beautiful too. And just honestly, everybody I spoke to just had so much to teach me, and I really, really enjoyed that process of it, for sure.
That sounds lovely. And we have, a few questions coming in here from people. Don't forget to leave your comments here on Facebook. But we have a couple of questions around people who are super, super busy. So people who just are very stressed for what they have to do in work. So one person emailed in and they said they feel like a fraud in their job at the moment. The workload is just horrendous. I get one thing done, 10 more things are flung at me. It's just a constant cycle of craziness. Having to manage staff, my anxiety levels are through the roof. This person sounds like they're super stressed. You had another question as well related to that about managing bosses who are asking a lot, and that's a man in Limerick who said, what's the best way to approach your manager? So two similar questions there on people who are dealing with very heavy workloads and as a result are feeling very anxious.
Yeah.
So what would your advice be based on what you've learned from the experts you talked to for your book?
Yeah, I think based on the advice given by experts in my book, I interviewed a really interesting woman called Annika Fogarty, who has a company called MindSmart, and she really very clearly and very rightly, I think, put the onus on employers.
Yeah.
So it's a really it's a really difficult. So I'm a freelancer. So what's great and terrible about that is that I am my own boss, and that was part of. And I'm pretty approachable, so it was easy for me to talk to myself. But actually, it's very challenging as well, as you know. So I think the best approach to that is maybe if you're finding it difficult to talk to your direct boss, is there someone on your team that you can confide with? Is there someone in? Do you have a HR department that you can talk to? Because I think if employers are smart, they will know that their staff and their team members, if they want to maintain high performances, that unrealistic workloads are, so damaging for morale, for energy levels. I believe that the best way to try and approach that is to ask for help. But I was really struck by that first question that was emailed in. There's kind of two issues that the writer brought up, and said that she'd been given 2 recent promotions.
Yes,
she said she felt good about the first one, but she was like, I definitely didn't. I'm so sorry. I actually don't know if that is a woman.
It's a man, actually. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Regardless,
internalized sexism. But it's just because I so associate that feeling of imposter with women, and that's very, very, very unfair of me, actually, because it is not just purely a female issue. Anyway, the point is, I just thought that person who's feeling like they didn't deserve the second promotion. So I think something that they can do for themselves is to trust that their bosses did not make the wrong choice.
Right.
So if you can't believe yourself, try to know that your boss did not make a mistake. So, for example, I used to think so I write for certain newspapers, and sometimes I think like, oh, maybe I felt like a fraud, like I didn't really know about food, and then I thought that's actually kind of insulting to the person who hired me to do this in a way, and that kind of helped me to change the way I was like, well, they must. It's like to get through that feeling of feeling like an imposter. Another approach that I have is when my inner critic starts talking to me, or when I have those feelings of feeling like a fraud, I look at the evidence. So when I was writing this book, there was loads of times when I was like, I'm not a writer. I'm not an organizational, and I am a writer, but I'm not an organizational psychologist. I'm not, I shouldn't be writing this book. Right. So then I looked at the evidence. So I thought, okay, well, I don't think my publishers would have asked me to write this book if I couldn't do it, or they didn't think that I could do it. So trying to be looking for, just being like approaching your imposter syndrome as an investigative journalist might approach a news story, I think is really good. So looking for real facts or alternative facts. So I just thought that person, if they could ease that feeling of imposter syndrome, that might make them, that's something they can do for themselves. Yes. To make, because that is a huge burden to carry around with, I think.
Absolutely. And that's, again, those two questions were about just being really busy in work, and you were suggesting share the load a bit in terms of talking to somebody that you work with about it, either your boss or otherwise. Just a couple of really quick fire questions that we'll get to really quickly before we wrap up this chat. One reader is wondering about how important is tracking. So you're a freelance worker, so you work with a lot of different bosses. Do you track? Do you use a particular system for yourself to keep organised?
Oh my gosh, I wish I did. I mean, I have notebooks.
So you take a lot of notes. And
yes, I do. It's something, it's a real constant, that's something I'm constantly working on, is trying to find new, the beauty of working for yourself is like you are creating your own work system and flow, but I'm still working on the best kind of system for that. But yeah, notebooks are good, if that answers the question. I'm not sure.
And I think other people have said as well, things like the system Trello, or you can read about bullet journaling, all those kind of things as well. So I suppose what you'd probably say is find a system, try a few ways, and maybe find one that works for you. Don't feel like you have to follow the herd, I suppose, maybe when it comes to it. Yeah,
I mean, I think in terms of technology as well, I think that suits lots of people and doesn't suit others. But so for me, I'm a bit more analog when it comes to organising myself, to be honest. Yeah,
same here. I'm pretty much the same. And a couple more then. There's a person which kind of connects with the first few questions you're asking there. Do you think that it could be a difficult thing for employees to talk about at work, this idea of being maybe overwhelmed or feeling you've so too much to do? I mean, in the book as well, you really extol the positives of going to talk to a therapist or a professional. But do you think it's quite hard for people to talk about, I'm overwhelmed and work?
Yeah, I feel like there's more room for the conversation in the last couple of years, and I think that's really, really positive. I think there's so many different reasons for that. I mean, if we think about the economy in the last 10 years, I think perhaps part of the reason why I personally got so burnt out is because I experienced a period of unemployment, and in desperation of never having to go through that again, I definitely worked way too hard and could not say no to things for fear of not being able to pay my rent. So that's what I think, and I know I'm not the only person who's carrying that around as well, no matter feeling like an imposter or anything like that, but the actual fear of being able to provide for yourself. So I think there's and so that's why I think this conversation around speed, expectations at work is so important, because I do think that there is such a massive difference between being busy and being effective and productive. And I know that I'm just very encouraged to hear the conversation going that way, but I do think that I think it just depends on your own working environment, whether you have the kind of supportive environment that you can say, like, I'm actually really overwhelmed, and how can we work together to do that. And there are things. So I think the biggest thing that has changed for me is my internal pace at work is much slower. So actually I am busier than I have ever been, because I've just now written this book, and and I'm promoting it and all of that kind of stuff. So that's just really exciting and brilliant. But I have definitely changed the internal pace, and also my expectations of myself are coming from a much kinder place as well. So that makes a big difference.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for answering all the readers' questions. Thanks for coming into Aoife McElwain. The book's called Slow at Work, How to Work Less, Achieve More